Welcome to Aristotle's Australia, an intellectual history of people and place. My name's Dr. Ben Jones, and this series is about the history of political ideas, how they've been rejected, accepted, or appropriated in Australia. This episode is called Fukuyama Down Under, the End of History and the Last Drongo. Francis Fukuyama is an American political scientist who in 1992 published a controversial, highly criticised but poorly understood book titled The End of History and the Last Man. An inaccurate but tenacious caricature of Fukuyama's most famous work has stalked his career ever since. And it paints him as a Cold War warrior, crowing that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the West has triumphed and could never seriously be challenged again. In some academic circles, Fukuyama has become a meme to be ridiculed, the ultimate example of Western hubris. I remember my own first encounter as an undergraduate. It was 2004, with Australia involved in simultaneous US-led wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The lecturer waved around a copy of the book, as if to say, can you believe this guy really claimed history ended in 1992? Reading it apparently was not necessary. The title alone would suffice. And the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Taliban's reoccupation of Afghanistan, and the rise of China are all examples of just how wrong he was. The problem with most of these criticisms, however, is that they come from people who have not read his book and certainly haven't read the 1989 essay where it came from. There are valid criticisms of Fukuyama, of course, but it's important to understand first what he actually argues before we can assess and see how it might have relevance to Australia. The first point to make is that Fukuyama's thesis was not tied to the Cold War. His argument was about ideas, not about states or events. His essay was titled The End of History, with a question mark at the end, and it was published in the journal National Interest in the northern summer of 1989, so it was written well before the Berlin Wall came down in November. It was obvious in early 1989 that the Eastern Bloc was in trouble, but Fukuyama was not attempting to be a prophet, and his theory could still be defended even if the communist states had regrouped and carried on. And indeed, even if Russia today was to completely drop its increasingly thin veneer of democratic governance, that would not necessarily invalidate what Fukuyama has to say. In an often quoted line, he states in the article that what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Few go on to quote the next sentence in the article, however, where he writes, "That's not to say there'll no longer be events. For the victory of liberalism has occurred primarily in the realm of ideas or consciousness, and it is as yet incomplete in the real or material world. But there are powerful reasons for believing that it is the ideal that will govern the material world in the long run." So Fukuyama was not predicting in 1989 that the United States would win the Cold War, and the subsequent book in 1992 was not a self-aggrandizing "I told you so." In fact, the Cold War is barely mentioned at all. Rather, this is a serious philosophical engagement with history in the Hegelian sense. Until such time as human life ceases, through nuclear annihilation, which was a frightening possibility in the 1980s, or as seems more likely today through catastrophic climate change and the Earth becomes uninhabitable, there will be events and personalities for historians to document. But Fukuyama argues that among ideologies, there is an endpoint. This is far from an original idea, of course. The Christian and Islamic faiths both teach that humanity is marching towards an endpoint, the final day of judgment. Marxist history contends that humanity has moved through various stages and that a communist utopia is the final destination. In a way, Fukuyama is building on this, but suggesting there's a different platform for our collective human train to reach. We've tried monarchies, theocracies, slave societies, feudalism, communism, fascism, but it's liberal democracy that has prevailed. And it's important at this point to reiterate that Fukuyama takes a decidedly teleological approach to history. That is to say, he doesn't believe that it moves in a cyclical fashion or what was old becomes new again, and he doesn't believe it randomly throws up events. Certainly he's no subscriber to Thomas Carlyle's great man in history theory. He subscribes to Hegel's ideas, which also profoundly shaped Karl Marx, that history is evolutionary and it is directional. The reason Fukuyama's outlook is teleological is because of collective learning and the accumulation of knowledge. In this sense, he's in line with a later Australian historian, David Christian, and his ideas about big history. Some states may take longer to get to liberal democracy than others. Some might revert from liberal democracy back to a previous form or to a dictatorship. Watching the rise of Trumpian populism and the 6 January 2021 attacks on the state capitol, it seemed that American democracy might suffer this fate. But even if the United States was to abandon liberal democracy, this doesn't invalidate Fukuyama's argument that liberal democracy is the end point of history. It's not that nothing else is possible, just that nothing is better. And that in the long run, it is the system people will return to. 3 decades after its publication, he has had to concede that long run may be a very long run. But he remains convinced of the central thesis: we won't come up with anything better, no matter how long we wait. Why is this so for Fukuyama? He draws on the work of the philosopher Alexandre Kochev and suggests that the universal ideas of liberty and equality espoused at the French Revolution, this articulation of the rights of man, which quickly expanded to be the rights of humanity, marked the end, or at least the beginning of the end of history. The idea that people have inherent worth and value that must be defended in the state and by the state is a key plank. Further, liberal democracy provides stable government and material prosperity. Citizens can reasonably expect a long and peaceful life, and if war does come, it will not be with another liberal democracy, but a state which has not yet reached the end point. But there is an important tension between liberty and equality, between striving for a just society where no one is left behind, and striving for a society that encourages dynamism, entrepreneurism, and allows space for those with talent and determination to rise above their peers. Fukuyama takes Plato's concept of thumos and suggests that there is a fundamental need for dignity, respect, and recognition for the human spirit. He notes that critics on the left fight social inequality, while critics on the right insist that those who work harder and smarter should get more. For Fukuyama, only liberal democracies allow room for both thumos and equality. Liberal democracy holds all citizens as inherently equal, but also nourishes the human spirit, because the legitimacy of the state is built upon public approval. Citizens express themselves through free elections And even if you don't get the result you want, it remains your government, accountable to you, and your voice has been heard. Within a liberal democracy, the tension between equality and thumos remains, but unlike other political systems, one or the other does not need to triumph. They can both be satisfied. In other political systems, people with strong thumotic tendencies end up leading religious cults or military dictatorships. In a liberal democracy, they're more likely to end up as a CEO or a hedge fund manager, where they will do less harm to society and may even do a little good. For Fukuyama, these are the twin elements which he suggests cannot be superseded: liberty and equality, rights and recognition. Fukuyama does not suggest that US-style democracy always lives up to these ideals, any more than the First French Republic did. Nor does he argue that democracy itself is without faults, only that these ideals have marked the ideological finish line. In the Eastern Bloc, there was a concerted effort to brainwash children so that they value the communist state, even above their friends or family. They were encouraged to inform on so-called counter-revolutionaries who would invariably end up in a Stasi cell, a Soviet gulag, or a Chinese re-education camp. In the late 1990s, I visited North Korea, the obscenely titled Democratic People's Republic. I saw primary school-aged children with red scarves passionately swear their devotion to the dear leader. They would now be in their 30s, and I can only imagine what horrors befell any who didn't continue to toe the party line, or indeed those who did. Fukuyama certainly doesn't propose that liberal democracies match this with state-sponsored brainwashing in favour of liberal democracy. It doesn't need it. Even if we take the pessimist line, the Churchillian position that liberal democracy is the least worst option, it still remains that nothing else on offer is better. And Fukuyama goes one further and claims something better simply doesn't exist. It can't exist. It is a strength of liberal democracy that rather than crushing dissent, it can self-scrutinise and adjust. He writes that the cause of liberal democracy is not necessarily best served by unthinking partisanship and by the failure to address squarely democracy's failings. It does not make you a counter-democrat or a traitor to liberalism to critique the liberal democratic state. Quite the contrary, this ability for self-analysis and self-correction is a key virtue. If it becomes too unequal, the government can suggest new policies, and if these do not satisfy the public, a new government can be elected. If it goes too far in the other direction and stifles thumos, again the people can send the pendulum back the other way. Democracy can and should be critiqued, moulded, and shaped, but it cannot be improved. The coupling of human rights and material prosperity with the recognition of individual dignity, housed within the legitimacy of a government that is accountable to the people, has not, and for Fukuyama, cannot be improved. Far from a triumphant boast, however, Fukuyama's book has a tone of sadness. He kept the title of the article for his book, supposedly at the insistence of his publisher, but along with the end of history, the question mark now removed in 1992, he added a subtitle, "And the Last Man." Just as the end of history does not mean the last thing of historical significance to occur, the last man does not mean the last human to live, but rather the final form of humanity. If the first man moved from the Hobbesian state of nature, where life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and into a society where he may be a peasant, effectively or literally a slave, the last man saw the birth of modernity, where he is collectively the master, and where his rights are won, not through struggle, but simply for being human. This is a good thing for Fukuyama, but he also recognised that something is lost. It was the great struggles of humanity that produced the most impressive art and culture. Drawing on Tocqueville, he suggests that instead of the great but useless things produced under aristocracies, epic poems, palaces, Fabergé eggs, democracies will produce useful but ugly items, machine tools, cookie-cutter homes in the suburbs with a Toyota Camry in the driveway. Life for the last man is not brutish and short, but it is boring and predictable. Instead of world wars, he enjoys the World Cup. Instead of battles of conquest, he rock climbs, skydives, trains to run a marathon. As Fukuyama writes, for where traditional forms of struggle like war are not possible, and where widespread material prosperity makes economic struggle unnecessary, thermotic individuals begin to search for other kinds of contentless activities that can win them recognition. With the great struggles of humanity in the past, life becomes like a Japanese tea ceremony, beautiful, formal, elegant, and pointless. But even if there is no utilitarian function, rival schools still develop. Different tea ceremony traditions evolve. There is a place for human creativity. But the stakes are now low. Our politics continue to change and evolve, but only within the bounds of liberal democracy. With the rise of fascism and communism in the 20th century, we saw the bloodiest century in human history. And by some counts, more lives were lost than in the previous 19 combined. If liberal democracy is the end point of history, and if this is the last man, it is because it is the only idea still standing, the worst, except for all the others. Where does this all leave Australia? If we follow Fukuyama's timeline, British colonisation began just as the final stage of modernity took hold in the 18th century. For many First Nations people, this marked a more literal end of history. The brutal nature of dispossession extinguished songlines that had survived for hundreds of generations. With remarkable speed, a convict colony turned into a liberal democracy by the 1850s. The Australian colonies soon surpassed Europe in extending democratic rights, first to men, then in 1902 to women also, the first place in the world to let women stand for Parliament. Australia deserved its reputation as a social laboratory of the world. From the development of the secret ballot, known for decades around the world as the Australian or Victorian ballot, to a constitution designed and approved through popular referendums, to the Harvester judgment, to compulsory voting, there was a boldness to Australian politics. It was a place unafraid to conduct democratic experiments. But somewhere in the late 20th century, this changed. Following a period of post-war prosperity, then the Whitlam reforms, a timidity crept into Australian politics that is matched by public ignorance and indifference about our civic institutions. The major parties began debating in louder voices about smaller policy differences. And in 1977, we changed our constitution for the last time. 3 minor, functional changes. With that, Australian politics appeared to expend its last morsel of energy. Safe, sensible changes were rejected one after another. A change to 4-year terms for MPs, enshrining fair elections, finally replacing the British monarch with an Australian head of state, all fell victim to misinformation and scare campaigns, and an electorate who largely did not understand how their political system worked or cared to learn. Even an opportunity to enshrine things like freedom of religion or the right to a jury trial was rejected with an unsubstantiated fear that somehow this could make things worse. This is the context in which the First Nations voice to Parliament is being debated. Despite the modest nature of the proposal, a simple advisory body, with its powers fully determined by Parliament, it is being misconstrued as some kind of radical change. In one sad example of rhetorical excess, a declaration of war on Australia. Over 2 decades ago, Professor Colin Tatt suggested that if there was a race between democratic nations to see who could best address the violation of human rights of its original people, Australia would be coming, stone, motherless last. The voice debate seems only to confirm this, and that for many, we've already reached our endpoint. Our politics have become stale and uninspired, a democratic tea ceremony full of symbolism and ritual, but unable to contemplate even minor reform, let alone the existential challenges of the 21st century. Fukuyama has argued recently that American politics groans under the burden of a vetocracy. The checks and balances to avoid the slide into dictatorship have been abused, and hyper-partisanship ensures that no opposition can resist the urge to shoot down government proposals, even if they see their merits, even if they've previously argued for the same thing. When the public finally vote them out, the new opposition are equally determined to veto the government's agenda. In Australia too, we've cultivated a politics of extreme negativity, where derailing the policies of your opponent is not only the smart option, but often the only one. And the media then rewards wreckers rather than innovators with airtime and newspaper inches. Like a car drifting slowly in neutral, we can steer a bit to the left or to the right, but not with any speed or urgency, before we eventually stop moving altogether. And if this is the case, if we have entered a stage in our political evolution where there is all noise and no action, then we're not at the end point, because this is unsustainable. If change and progress is no longer possible under an aggressive vetocracy, then its days are surely numbered. But perhaps a way forward will emerge within Australia's liberal democratic system, and we will see glimpses, if not a full return, to the dynamism and bravery of previous generations, a refusal to accept the status quo in perpetuity, and a willingness to take chances in the hope of a better future. There are worse places to live than Australia, and certainly worse times in history to have lived. If Australia has reached its own end of history, we can consider ourselves a generally lucky country. But to zoom the ideological lens out, Fukuyama also suggests in the article that it is a very sad time. He writes, "The struggle for recognition, the willingness to risk one's life for a purely abstract goal, the worldwide ideological struggle that called forth daring, courage, imagination and idealism, will be replaced by economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands." And there is something sad when contemplating that the large struggles in Australia may be finished. That's not to say that there are no noble causes. One of the common criticisms of Fukuyama is that he idealises the liberal democratic state and doesn't acknowledge the wide gulf between rich and poor in the United States, and one might add in Australia also. He does acknowledge, however, that there are still battles for equality. Even in 1992, he noted, forms of inequality such as racism, sexism, and homophobia have displaced the traditional class issue for the left. Today we could add trans rights to the list. And in Australia, closing the gap for First Nations people in terms of health, life expectancy, education, and sharing in the relative prosperity of the nation, there certainly remains important things to fight for. Understood as a work of political philosophy, not a history, not a prophecy, The End of History and the Last Man remains a robust and provocative read. Developments in the past 30 years have not proved or disproved his thesis. Neither the creation of Islamic State or the rise of China has shaken his conviction that liberal democracy is the end point of history, because it remains the only system to satisfy, however imperfectly, the human desire for both rights and recognition. He did not and does not subscribe to the Huntington thesis that there is an inevitable clash of civilizations, and he has said many times in public lectures and his subsequent writings that an Americanization of the world and a homogenization of culture is neither likely nor desirable. Whether you agree or disagree with Fukuyama, his thesis leaves us with a challenge. If you do not believe that with liberal democracy, modernity has reached its endpoint, there remains an imperative to make it more tolerable as long as it does exist, both in terms of increasing freedom and decreasing inequality until such time as a new civilization descends. Perhaps artificial intelligence will be harnessed in such a way to eliminate the need for parliaments and voting, a vision of the future that can be equally utopian or nightmarish. Perhaps the nation-state will cease to be the primary way we organise our societies. Alternatively, you might look at the relative wealth of an Australian household today, the level of education, life expectancy, access to medicine, opportunities to travel, read, enjoy leisure time, and compare that to a century ago or 2 centuries ago, and conclude that liberal democracy has done, warts and all, a pretty good job. And that's not to pretend that the wealth has been shared evenly, nor to deny that women, people of colour, and especially First Nations have faced and continue to face discrimination. But if you do agree with Fukuyama that liberal democracy is the final destination, in fact, especially if you agree with him, there is an onus to not let our politics become a meaningless tea ceremony, but to use the internal levers to pursue greater justice for all citizens. History shows us just how fragile an institution democracy is. Athenian democracy lasted only 2 centuries. If you trace Australian democracy to the period of responsible government, when colonial governments became democratic in the 1850s, it's lasted nearly as long. While it may seem inconceivable that Australia would ever abandon democracy, there are concerning cracks in the walls. One recent poll suggested only 60% of Australian voters think democracy is better than any other system of government. A quarter think non-democratic government could be better, and a further 15% think it doesn't really matter at all. Whether in liberal democracy we have reached the end of history or not, there definitely is value in examining our institutions, educating our citizens on how they work, encouraging active participation, and cherishing the elements that matter to us. Because we don't know if there is some utopia out there, as yet unconceived in our political imagination, but we do know for sure that there are many systems that are much worse. Thank you for your kind attention. Just as Fukuyama believed that every society would eventually become a liberal democracy, I believe that every white male academic will eventually start a podcast. Please let me know if you've enjoyed this one and if you have ideas for future episodes or political thinkers you'd like to hear about. Until next time, if there is a next time, take care.